Hi, I'm Amy McDonald. I run this joint, and it's killing me. How many people, this is your first time here? Come back. Welcome. I like to call, we've been operating now for 8 months. I like to call City Space the 92nd Street Y of Boston. We do everything. We do music, we do dance, we do cooking, we do live podcasts, we do mock storytelling, and we do politics. I just want to introduce Bob Oakes especially tonight. Today, November 5th, is the 40th anniversary of Morning Edition when it aired on NPR. And Bob Oakes has been the WBUR's host of Morning Edition. He's going to kill me that I'm saying this, for 27 years. So congratulations, Bob.
A long, long time with no sleep. Let me read an introduction before we get going. Welcome to WBUR City Space at the Levine Broadcast Center. We hope tonight that we're going to have an informative, spirited discussion about the candidates and the issues in the 2020 race. And in terms of shameless self-promotion, if you like what you see here tonight, as Amy said, we'd love to have you back again. You can check out the full lineup of events online at wbur.org/events or share us on social media at WBUR City Space. As we all know, for many reasons and for many people on both sides of this campaign, this is the most important election of their lifetimes. Will President Trump be reelected? Will he survive what seems to be the growing likelihood of impeachment in the House and then a possible trial in the Senate? If Trump is on the ballot, can Biden, Warren, Sanders, Buttigieg, or one of the other Democrats beat him? Where does the winner take the nation on the issues, the important issues, healthcare, gun control, immigration, abortion, a woman's right to choose, the right to life? We'll talk about the candidates, the campaigns, and impeachment, but we'd like to start with issues tonight, and here's why. If you listen a lot, you know that WBUR decided after 2016 that in covering 2020, we could not be led around by the nose by the candidates again. We couldn't simply cover the latest furor over the latest tweet. So we decided to let the voters choose how we largely cover the campaign by identifying the issues that you deemed important. We polled in Eastern Mass and Southern New Hampshire this summer, and we found that the top issues were healthcare, jobs and the economy, immigration, Social Security, Medicare, and climate change, and you can put that slide up if you have the slide available. Beyond that, guns were a top issue for Republicans, and defeating Donald Trump is a top issue for the Democrats. So, with those figures in mind, and with what's happening on the campaign trail right now in mind, Kimberly, I want to start with you. Before we get into the division among the Democrats running for president on this issue, in the big picture, after the 2018 House win, Democrats thought that health care would be the big winning issue for them in 2020, right? That's correct. And do you sense it's still that way, or has it changed?
I think for Democrats, it's still a big issue. We see from the poll, I think it's definitely the issue of the Democratic primary. Now, whether that will be the big issue going into the general, I think might be very different. But I think there is this, there was a lot of concern at the beginning of the Democratic primary with all, 287 candidates, that this sort of hash out about all of these issues would divide the Democrats. In the end, it could harm them. It would make it difficult for them to come together. From what I have heard so far, and I would love to hear what Anthony has to say on this too, for voters love that these candidates are talking about it. Even if they may or may not agree with every aspect, every point in a plan, if they may not even understand every aspect or point in the plan, they're excited that instead of just the division and the Twitter feed, that there is a discussion going on about how you get health care, how you get everyone covered under health care, which was the goal of Obamacare, but that still hasn't happened. There's a discussion discussion about education, a discussion about gun control. I think what that has done is helped the Democrats, regardless of what where they stand on each of these issues, to energize and excite voters and to remind them why the election is important. And that's what whomever wins the primary, their number one goal is going to be a numbers game. They're going to have to convince people to come out and vote rather than sitting out if the Democrat is going to win. In a way that I think Donald Trump, it doesn't have that long haul in pulling people out because his support among Republicans is so strong. So I think in that sense, healthcare has really helped to move that needle. It's given that, of course, it's given the candidates a place to disagree, to distinguish themselves from one another. But it's certainly been an important inflection point, I think, for Democrats.
All right, let's talk about the division. Anthony, the divide in some ways really couldn't be deeper right now between the top Democrats in the race. Sanders and Warren pushing for health care or Medicare for all. Biden and Buttigieg and others pressing for strengthening Obamacare or for allowing for, they call it the public health care option. Really, it's the private health care option by private insurance. At the moment for Democrats, as we're saying, it's the most talked about issue, especially since last week when under pressure, Warren outlined her plan to pay for Medicare for all. You've reported on this. Tell us how you think this has either helped or hurt her campaign.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I think it's sort of too soon to know for sure, but I was actually talking to Kimberly before we were starting, and I said to her, I sort of have the sense that since she's trotted out that plan, the details of that plan, that her honeymoon has sort of ended. Not that it's a bad plan necessarily, because I can sort of see both sides of why she's doing it. But suddenly she's got a target on her back. Her critics have something to latch on to. Conservative economists are pointing out why the plan is flawed. Joe Biden, Pete Buttigieg are taking pot shots at her. And Buttigieg, I think, is doing it quite well, sort of saying, hey, most people prefer a public option. Let's do a plan with a little more humility. And, Warren is hitting back with lines like, Democrats shouldn't be running in this primary using Republican talking points. So it is kind of mixing it up a bit. But in the way that I think it works for her, Elizabeth Warren's whole approach in this primary is go big or go home. And she doesn't plan to go home. She wants to go big. So this sort of plays to that message. This is something she really, really believes in. And she said she was going to put out a plan about how to pay for it, and she did that. On the other hand, as I mentioned before, it does give folks something to latch onto and to oppose her on. And I think we're going to see her much more on the defensive in a way that we haven't seen her in a long time. In terms of what you said, Kimberly, I just want to chime in really quickly on this. It's what people are talking about. If I go to a campaign event in New Hampshire or Iowa or South Carolina, almost everyone, when you ask voters, anecdotally, this is my experience, what's the most important issue? Again and again and again, it is health care. So there's a reason why this is being talked about in the way it is being talked about.
Kimberly, did Warren make herself harder to sell outside of her circle and her hardcore supporters because of the plan to fund her health care plan?
I think it's too early. It's too early to know. I mean, we do know from some polling that she has had a tougher time in some head-to-head matchups. That New York Times poll that came out this week that had a lot of interesting information that she did not perform as well vis-a-vis Donald Trump in some key battleground states. I'm sure that's something that is concerning to her campaign as compared to someone like Joe Biden. But I think overall, and this is just my hunch because it's still a year out and a lot can change in a year, but I think overall that Democrats are happy that people are talking about things like health care, and in the end, it's less about the specifics of the plan. Look, Obamacare was just implemented really recently, and everybody remembers all of the big the big selling point of it. And then there was the actual implementation. It ran into hiccups, it ran into problems, things had to be redone, things had to be pulled back. Everybody is still not covered. And I don't think that I think most voters realize that even the best carefully laid out plan by Elizabeth Warren probably won't be implemented exactly as she is selling it. But they're happy she's selling it. There are some people who are a little more concerned. They want to hold on to their health care plans. They want to make sure everything is affordable. I think we have to wait to see how all that plays out in the margins. But I think regardless of the issue, I think healthcare is the place where there's the biggest differences among the candidates. But I think even still, at the end of the day, when you move into the general, where all the Democrats are in healthcare, you can fit in a space about that big, and where the Republicans are is someplace entirely else. So I don't think that somebody's who really wants Medicare for all, if Joe Biden is elected, is gonna say, oh, I'm not gonna vote for him because he's not for Medicare for all. I mean, I just don't see that happening at the end. I think that the discussion about healthcare by everyone is only helping the Democrats.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I mean, just last week up in New Hampshire, Warren was being pressed by some reporters about, why you're going so big, why not do something that's easier to sell, why not the public option? And she just sort of put up her hand and said, look, at the end of the day, when we're running against Donald Trump, we're going to be debating ways to cover everybody versus a president who has done nothing on health care and actually tried to dismantle Obamacare. So in effect, she was saying, give me that debate any day of the week. I feel good about that.
Well, while Democrats are probably happy that their candidates are having the debate and are raising the issue, they are most certainly forming opinions about what they like and what they don't like from what they know so far. Could you bring up that other slide now, if you would? In terms of health care being a hard sell for Warren, Anthony, you and Martha Beeminger recently reported a story on another WBUR poll, part of which you're seeing right there, which showed even Massachusetts Democrats favored a Medicare for all plan that allowed people to keep their private insurance if they wanted to. Tell us about that. Expand on these.
Yeah, interesting. There was, I knew you were going to talk about this. I actually have some of the numbers in front of me. I mean, it's interesting. This poll, super interesting. So 90% of Democratic voters here in Massachusetts say they're either very satisfied or somewhat satisfied with their current health insurance. We found that really striking, 90%. But then a solid majority, 64%, say that the overall system is working somewhat poorly or very poorly. And those two things seem to those two numbers seem to be in conflict with each other. But Steve Koczela, our pollster, claims this is what you often see in polls. And the best example is Americans have a very, very low opinion of Congress, for example, but they keep re-electing their congressmen and congresswomen. So it's like up close, and this is what we keep hearing about everyone who has private health insurance. They really like their private health insurance plan, most of them. But they recognize that overall the system is broken and needs work. Because in our same poll, I'll just give you one more. Yeah, a solid majority, 64% say that the system is working either poorly or somewhat poorly. Nearly a quarter of those polled say that in the last year, the cost of health care caused them to skip or delay a medical treatment. So that is an indication that people really get that it isn't working. And when it comes to Medicare for all, there's pretty broad support, 65% support it, but an even bigger majority, 80% support what's known as Medicaid for all who want it, or the public option. So that's an example that even in deep blue Massachusetts, in Elizabeth Warren's, what should be her home turf, she's got a bit of a job to sell it even here. And so that's what she's going to be dealing with out there. And I think at the next debate, there are going to be a lot of questions, as there have been, posed to Elizabeth Warren about this.
All right, Kimberly, so take this back to Washington then. We know, as you've both talked about, and we know from the newspaper headlines that her fellow candidates, or some of them, are taking pot shots at her over her plan. But what are you hearing from non-candidate, rank and file Democrats in Washington about this? Are they nervous about the nominee proposing essentially a rewrite of healthcare in America and a rewrite of the U.S. economy at the same time?
Yeah, no, I think honestly, I mean, I haven't heard a lot of substantive pushback against the idea of this big plan. I think, frankly, they're happy that this debate is happening among the candidates for president and not among them. Like, it's taking the heat off of them in a way for having to deal with the fact the Democrats in Congress are solely focused on the point that you brought up, is the Trump administration's move and continued move to dismantle Obamacare. They say that they passed this law, they were doing everything they can to fix the problems with it, and at this point there is a systemic attack on the healthcare policy by the president, and that seems uniformly what they're focused on. And they too are happy that the Democrats in the race are focusing on these issues, but it also takes the heat off of them a little bit. Right?
All right, one more or two more Warren-centric questions here, since she's sort of our homegrown candidate, even though she talks a lot more about her Midwest upbringing on the campaign trail than she talks about Massachusetts. Anthony, you spent a lot of time following Warren right from the start. In that time, she was at the bottom and now pretty close to the top of the polls. What's the campaign doing right in the big picture?
Well, I mean, I think the most compelling thing that she managed to do from early on is she has a credible story to tell. She's got a story about who she is. She links that to, the whole story about growing up on the ragged edge of the middle class. And then she links that to her analysis of how the economy used to work and used to help her family. And then she links that sort of to what has to happen and how we have to fix this economy to make it work for a larger share of Americans. And I think she does that in a way, when people have 30 or 40 minutes with her, she usually tells a pretty good story that's pretty convincing. And they leave, if not supporting her, at least understanding why she's running for president. And I compare that to Hillary Clinton's challenge. I don't think Clinton really figured that out in 2016. She was supremely qualified. Arguably, she probably would have been a decent president. But she never sort of had that, why is she running for president? What's the one big program that she's talking about? And I think the other thing that Warren has done really, really well that resonates with a lot of people is, I think the central theme of her campaign is government corruption. And she's really come up with a bunch of ideas to address that. And everything she talks about, whether it's healthcare, which, by the way, she doesn't talk about that much, but that's another conversation. But whether it's how to fund student loans, whatever it is, it comes down to the way government is controlled by special interests and big money. And that's what she's talking about. And by the way, that's the same message Donald Trump used so effectively when he was running for president. She doesn't say drain the swamp, but she's talking about it in very concrete ways. And I think that has resonated very well with her supporters.
Kimberly, you get to do the other side. What's Warren not doing well?
Well, I think it has been a challenge, not just for Warren, but for a lot of the candidates on the Democratic side, to appeal as broadly as they're going to need to appeal in order to win. It's going to be a lot harder. Democrats are just a lot more diverse in every way, racially, geographically, economically, than the Republicans are in this race. And it's been really tough, especially as the national media is so focused on the impeachment proceedings, and there are so many candidates. It's hard for everyone. But I mean, again, I've seen with Warren, when she's in a room with people in the Black community, people in different parts of the country, she is good in the room, but you can't be in every room.
Right.
And it has been a struggle with her. She's made some progress to resonate in some of the other communities. I think she'll probably do pretty well in New Hampshire and Iowa. The question is, can she do as well in South Carolina, Nevada, California? We don't know yet. But again, this is an issue that all of the candidates not named Biden is having right now.
Right. All right. Let's bring in our other two guests now. Come on up, folks. Let me introduce, if I might, Shermichael Singleton, Republican consultant, writer, political commentator, worked on the presidential campaigns of Mitt Romney, Newt Gingrich, and Dr. Ben Carson. Shermichael, good evening. Thanks a lot for coming up from D.C. And Adrienne Elrod, Democratic political strategist, senior advisor to Hillary Clinton's presidential campaigns in 2008 and 2016. Thanks for coming up from
Thank you for having me.
So this is a question for both of you, and it's on the headlines today. Above the fold in the New York Times today, the headline, Donald Trump remains competitive, if not leading, in the 6 battleground states that went Republican in 2016 and gave him the election: Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Florida, Arizona, and North Carolina. What did you make of this? What should we make of it? And Shermichael, as the Republican, why don't you start?
Sure. I mean, I think that there has been a notion, particularly on mainstream media, which the three of us appear on pretty regularly, that what sort of resonates in places like D.C., New York, maybe even a city like Boston, resonates in places like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Iowa, and that's just not the case. And so when I look at a lot of the national polling data, the first question that I always ask myself, did they poll people outside of major cities in some of these states? And what you saw in 2016 was that there were people who just were not represented at all in the data. I'm a data guy. I'm a political guy. I look at the data. I look at the numbers to try to create the best strategy for my candidate. And I think what the Trump campaign was effective at doing in 2016, I think they'll be even more effective at doing in 2020, is targeting people who are just not included. People who have just become so disengaged with the political process that when pollers are trying to talk to folks and ask these various questions to quantify data, they're not reaching those people. And when you think about this is an electoral game. It ultimately comes down to, can you win enough counties and precincts to total up to enough numbers to win the Electoral College? It's not the popular vote. Popular vote just doesn't really matter. That's just a reality. And what the Trump campaign is really focusing on, which is something that I don't think is covered enough in the press, is where can we make sure that we win ground to win the Electoral College? They're not really concerned with the popular vote because the campaign has accepted that their room for growth beyond that 35 to 40% is just non-existent. So how can we target people, not only folks who we know we have, but how many others who we could potentially have that we're just not engaging with yet? And I think that's something we're missing.
You know, you make me wonder. A lot of the mainstream media, when they watch Trump go out, once a week or twice a week and speak to a rally and speak to his base, they say, well, he's only speaking to the base. He's not expanding the crowd. But what you seem to be saying is that in so doing, he may be reaching people that he didn't reach the last time.
No, I think that's exactly what I'm saying. I mean, there's something called voter prospecting. And so Brad Parscale, who's the guy who's leading Trump's campaign, he's a campaign manager, what he sort of has this idea, which is very different. It's not conventional wisdom. When I worked on Gingrich's campaign, the Romney campaign, we sort of did things the traditional way. He has this idea that they can, by individually connecting with people that they don't already have contact with, they could potentially expand their ability to mobilize people in place in those key battleground states. So instead of targeting, let's say 700,000 volunteers to have direct voter contact, he's now talking about nearly 2 million volunteers in some of those key swing states to have direct voter contact. So again, I think when you think about this operationally and you think about winning those counties in those key swing states to total up to winning the Electoral College, I think that they are at an advantage that we're just quite frankly not giving them credit for.
All right, Adrienne, does the Times story this morning give you pause? Should it frighten Democrats?
It doesn't give me pause. I mean, it certainly validates, I think, what a lot of my sources and a lot of people on the campaign trail right now believe, which is this is going to be a very difficult election. To Shermichael's point, and I think all of us, and you are all very sophisticated NPR listeners, and you know that this election is not won and fought, or will not be won and fought among the popular vote. It's going to be in 7 or 8 key battleground states. And it's going to come down to several 100,000 people who literally make up the election, who decide the election. And those people, again, are going to be in some of those very key states. So when you look at the national polls, I do a lot of Morning Joe. And Morning Joe likes to start off Mondays with the latest poll that shows, Elizabeth Warren, Joe Biden, Mayor Pete, Kamala Harris sometimes. A lot of these candidates beat Bernie Sanders, beating Donald Trump in a national head-to-head. But ultimately, that doesn't matter. Sure, it's good for you to go out to your donors and say, hey, listen, look at this. I can beat Trump in Texas by, 8 points, or I can beat Trump in, overall by 10 points. But what really matters are those key states, North Carolina, Arizona, Iowa. I mean, you name them, right? Those are the key states. Of course, Wisconsin and Michigan, Pennsylvania, those are the key states that will determine this election. So, look, props to the New York Times for putting this on the front page above the fold, because I think it's something that everyone needs to realize. We are 1 year out from the election, and people need to be aware that this is not going to be a cakewalk for Democrats. It feels like it should be. I mean, we watch Trump go on, national television every single day becoming unhinged, or he is unhinged. But that does not necessarily mean that Donald Trump is going to lose the election. He is speaking to a lot of people. To the point that Shermichael made, his campaign is far more organized this time around than they were in 2016. I'll never forget listening to Steve Bannon in an interview post-election talk about his frustration walking into the campaign headquarters a couple Sundays before the campaign and saying, where is everybody? And somebody said, oh, it's, Sunday morning. People usually don't come in till like 1 or 2 in the afternoon. I mean, I can tell you guys, we were at the office every single day, including Sundays, 6-7 months out at 8 o'clock in the morning. During the weekdays, we were there at 6:30 to 7 a.m. in the morning, didn't leave until almost midnight. I mean, we were burning the candle at both ends. And the fact that his campaign didn't have the apparatus that they have now, they're far more organized, far more sophisticated. They've got a very strong digital operation. They're raising a lot of money. It's not a doomsday scenario by any stretch of the imagination for Democrats, but I think the New York Times placing these battleground polls where they did was a very good wake-up call for the people of my party.
All right. I want to ask about the economy, a couple of questions. What happens to Donald Trump's reelection chances should the economy slip or tank in 2020, as some or many economists predict? Adrienne, you start.
Yeah, look, I think if the economy, if we truly go into a recession, and I think we're obviously starting to see signs of recession, but if we actually go into a recession, Donald Trump will not get reelected. I mean, the only thing that he's got going for him really right now in a lot of these battleground states is the economy. Even that being said, there are plenty of voters, and when you get into the crosstabs on some of these polls, in especially manufacturing states that Trump won in 2016, a lot of voters who voted for him were saying, you know what, I'm still not really feeling any change. My wages remain stagnant. I'm not working in a job that I want to be working in. He's got to hope and pray that the economy holds to where it is today, because I think if it tanks, he will not be reelected. At the same time, I think if the economy doesn't tank and still remains somewhat intact, there's still a very decent chance that Democrats will win. But I think if the economy goes south, it's going to be really bad for Trump.
Sure, Michael?
No, I would agree with Adrienne's assessment. I mean, I do think it becomes incredibly difficult. But for me as a strategist, if I were advising the president and his campaign, my question would be, if the economy does indeed tank to those potential voters, particularly independents, the folks in the middle, at 3 or 5%, that would ultimately roughly translate to about 700,000, to Adrienne's point. My argument to those folks would be, okay, the economy's slowing down, it's not doing as well, consumer confidence has decreased. We're at a point where we should sort of start experiencing a recession in the next, I guess, year or two. That's expected. But when you look at me, again, this is me advising Trump. If you look at what I have done, trade, that's one example. I think you could expect some kind of deal with China pretty soon. That would be smart. I think Trump will talk about the courts. I think he'll talk about deregulation. And then he'll say, well, look at someone like Elizabeth Warren. And look at what she wants to do for the economy. Look at all of these great, grandiose plans. How can we pay for them? Who's going to be taxed? Who's going to be burdened? She talks about the wealthy, but are they enough to cover some of these plans? And I think so. Some folks will find themselves at a reflection point, and they will say, well, I mean, that's a good point. Do I want to go with what I know, which may be bad as far as his character, but other things I may like? Or do I want to go with a great big unknown? A lot of great ideas, but I don't know how realistic these ideas are. Can you get these things passed in Congress? I mean, it's so fascinating to me that when we talk about these things and these plans from my friends on the left, who I have a lot of respect and esteem for, how can you get them past a Mitch McConnell-controlled Senate? how can you get them passed in a House where you will have moderate Democrats whom some of them may even lose their seats next year because of their vote for impeachment, who may say, Speaker Pelosi, I stuck my neck out on the line. I saw what happened to my friends. I'm not willing to take that vote this time around. So I think there are serious lingering questions that the Trump campaign could pose to voters, particularly independents, that will give them pause to say, you know what, I need to think about this a little longer.
In terms of messaging, Anthony, for the Democrats, as we've talked about, healthcare is dominating the chatter right now. But is this really what they want to be talking about?
Healthcare? Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with Kimberly what she said. I mean, I think this is a winning topic for Democrats because I think it stands in stark contrast to what the Republicans are trying to do to Obamacare. But I wanted to add to what Shermichael was saying, because one of the things that was so interesting in that above the fold poll in the New York Times was just a reminder of how conservative, how moderate those voters are in those swing states. I mean, there were some amazing statistics. One of them, so 26%, by a margin of 74% to 24%, they said they would prefer more moderate Democratic nominee than a liberal nominee. So that tells me that that's would be sort of prime opportunity for Republicans should someone like Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders be nominated. And then they also had an astounding number, and Kim, I think we were talking about this before, of the folks who voted for, who flipped a purple district blue, essentially, in the last election. A large share of them, I think 2/3, said they're going to vote for Donald Trump, even though they voted for a Democratic member of Congress in the last election. So this is a very swing statey part of the country, if that's an adjective that I can just invent. But you know what I mean.
All right, let's talk about the topic in the news that has many people focused hour by hour, if not minute by minute, impeachment. In today's news, what do you make of the apparent shift in GOP strategy or talking points that maybe, okay, there was a quid pro quo in the Ukraine conversation between the two presidents, but it doesn't matter because that's not an impeachable offense? Adrienne, you're shaking your head.
Yeah, listen, I did some Sunday TV this past weekend and did a lot of commenting on Kellyanne Conway and Steve Scalise and some of the surrogates that the Trump campaign and the Trump White House put out, and I give them credit, they all stuck to this very lame, for lack of a better term, talking point in this lame position. But again, I think you got to take a step back and look at everything through the lens of what matters, how does this shift the electorate? And unfortunately, I think there are a lot of voters out there who are barely turning into television, who might have seen a couple clips from the weekend and thought, you know what, they're actually right. It doesn't really matter. I mean, it should matter, but I'm not sure how much voters really care. First of all, the Trump administration, the Trump campaign is very good at confusing people, right? They throw so much information out there. They barrage you with misinformation, Trump tweets, Trump saying crazy things on the White House lawn. The media can barely keep up with it. And so the takeaway is sort of, well, the economy's okay. Look, Ukraine still got our taxpayer money. That's how I think a lot of people are looking at this, and they're thinking, well, I mean, I say a lot of people in the sense that that very small sliver of voters who will decide this election. Of course, it fires at people like me on the left. It fires at people in my party, and it makes us angry. And I think anybody who understands the Constitution and has an intellectual appreciation for what the president should do and his aides in adhering to the Constitution is extremely frustrating. But, again, I mean, I will give Republicans they have always been so much better than Democrats in terms of sticking to a very disciplined message, even if that message seems insane to a lot of people who, again, have a great appreciation for the Constitution and a great appreciation for, the power of the presidency and not abusing that power. It's appalling what these people get away with.
But is there more than just sticking to the message? When I heard that, I said to myself, could accepting, so to speak, a quid pro be an effort to inoculate the president against a quid pro finding so that voters say a year from now, oh yeah, I heard all about that. That was so long ago and it didn't mean anything.
But they're going to be saying the Senate acquitted him anyway. So, I think this remains a big risk for the Democrats for that reason. If it goes to a trial in the Senate.
Kimberly?
Yeah, it is. Look, Republicans are trying to find a way to inoculate this president and to inoculate themselves for a couple of reasons. One, polls have consistently shown that Trump's core support, while nowhere near a majority, has remained incredibly inelastic. And Trump's support among Republicans, although it has dipped down into the 80s. Okay, it's extremely strong. And so Republicans believe, the majority of them believe that they have to stick to, dance with the ones that brung them. And they are trying to find a way. The shifting of the explanation and the defense is the fault of the White House. The president is throwing out all these things and confusing everyone, including the Republicans. There is no war room. There is no central strategy. It is completely different than with the Clinton impeachment proceeding. And the Republicans have sort of had to get together on their own to defend not only against the Democrats, but against some who may come from within their own ranks who may not be able to make that same argument with a straight face. People who are unwilling to, perhaps Senator Mitt Romney will be among those who are unwilling to. And a lot of other vulnerable Republicans who will be unable to, like Susan Collins, like Cory Gardner, like other people are trying to hold on to their seats, and it puts them in a tough position. I think this is trying to maybe give some of them cover, but it's difficult when you have a president who does not believe in strategy, who believes only in his gut, and that he knows how to beat this, and he's just bringing all the other Republicans along for a ride.
And can I make a really quick point on what Kimberly just said? I think it's important when we're all watching this impeachment process to keep in mind the following. 2018 was a huge year for Democrats in the down ballot races. As a consequence, most of the swing seats that are in the House right now in Congress are currently owned by Democrats, right? Which means that if you're a Republican sitting in Congress right now, with a few exceptions, you are in a pretty solidly red seat, congressional seat. That is why I think you're seeing Republicans in the House just lean into this. They are leaning into their base. They are leaning into Trump. You're going to see a totally different situation in the Senate because you do have people like Tom Tillis, Cory Gardner, people who are Joni Ernst, senators who are in tough reelections. They're going to be looking at those poll numbers, those very small 2 to 3 points that are teetering back and forth among independents and swing voters to sort of decide what they do. But the House is so solidly red that, of course, if you're a Republican in the House, you're going to be 1,000% with Trump. You're going to lean into it in every way. You're going to go on TV and say whatever, Kellyanne Conway says. You're going to essentially repeat that throughout the week because there is no war room to tell you what to do. That is the talking point. But you just got to keep in mind that we're dealing with a very red group of members of Congress in the House, but a very swingable group of senators in the Senate.
So, which leads to this question, given that the House is controlled by Democrats right now, this question assumes, which seems to be a reasonable assumption as of like 7:13 on this night, that the House will vote to impeach President Trump. From what we know today, Shermichael, do you think there's much of a chance the GOP-controlled Senate will vote to remove Trump following a Senate trial?
No, I don't think the president's going to be convicted. I do think you could possibly see 2 to 3 Republican senators possibly vote to convict the president. But I think he's safe. And I think politically, if I'm working for the Republican Congressional Committee, I'm looking at the 42, 43 moderate Democrats who beat Republicans in 2018. And what I'm going to do is create a list of those who are most vulnerable. And by that, I mean individuals who only won by 8%, 7%, anyone who won by less than 10%. I'm going to focus on all of those congressional seats because we already know, according to polling data, that most of their constituents, this isn't a top 5 issue. Impeachment is not a top 5 issue. And I'm going to hammer hard every single day, every single week in those congressional districts. You voted for this person for whatever reason. They're not doing their job. They're focused on this witch hunt, if you will. And this is all just optics here, folks. I'm just talking purely political strategy, not the morals of this, not the ethics of this. I would agree with Adrienne that I think what the president has done and continues to do is absurd. And personally, I think he should be impeached. But that's not the way politics works. So in speaking how politics works, I think that Republicans should do that. They likely will do that, from my understanding of several former colleagues who are working for the Republican Congressional Committee. That is the focus. You only need 21, 22 congressional seats for Republicans to take back control of the House. I don't think those margins are likely, but I do think that there is a very realistic possibility for Speaker Pelosi to go into 2021 as a weaker speaker. I actually think some of those congressional seats could flip back to Republicans. And again, I'm only focused on those who won by 10% or less. That's not a significant number. You're talking about maybe, 20,000 votes or something, maybe even less. Those are numbers that you can certainly move, at least in my personal experience, back into your corner.
All right. Let me come back to the Senate, if I might. He's been a vocal critic of the president. I'll curl my mustache as I talk about Pierre Delecto. AKA former Massachusetts governor, current U.S. Senator from Utah, Mitt Romney. You've done some reporting on this, Kimberly. What do you think Romney's role might be in a Senate trial? Could it be pivotal?
We don't know, because Mitt Romney has been, I think I may have used the word fickle, when I talked about his history in challenging the president. He was, vocally against him in 2016, and then he thought he would be just what the country needed after the election when he was being considered for a Secretary of State, and then he criticized him again for some things he said, like the president's remarks after Charlottesville, but then he thanked him for his Senate endorsement. I mean, he's been all over the place. You all are from Massachusetts. You remember the Mitt Romney who was, pro-choice before he was pro-life. So this is sort of par for the course. It seems, though, in recent weeks that he has taken a stronger stand. The one thing that is different, which I pointed out to my point earlier, is that Mitt Romney is from a state where, although Trump won it, he didn't win it by the margins that he did in other red states. He is fairly unpopular in Utah. Mitt Romney is very popular in Utah. That seat is his for as long as he wants it. Mitt Romney will never appear on a ballot with Donald Trump. So yeah, Donald Trump can tweet at him and attack him and call him names. It doesn't matter for him politically. Mitt Romney is a former nominee for the Republican presidential race. Mitt Romney already has his place in political history. So he doesn't have a lot here to lose. And I am told that this time he is really doing this because of actual conviction. I think the answer is we will see. I think it's still, given the fact that given all of those factors, that he has not been a lot more vocal. He has not been a Justin Amash during this process, kind of shows that he still understands the perils, not just for him, but for his fellow Republicans in the Senate and in the House, who he doesn't want to see hurt by this. But he could take a bullet on this and really try to give some other folks cover. I'm wondering. I'm told that he has not tried to convince others at this point.
Does he?
But he could. I mean, he could call, Susan Collins. He could call some.
Well, does he have enough juice? Does he have enough influence in the Senate, maybe with Collins, to bring other senators along? Do you want to take that? Anyone else want to take that?
I mean, I think Mitt Romney's role could serve, to Kimberly's point, to sort of provide cover for some of those vulnerable Republicans, some of the names that have come up. You have individuals who, I mean, God, Susan Collins, she could potentially lose. I don't think she will. Johnny Ernst, Cory Gardner. I mean, these are folks who are going to be facing very, very uphill battles next year. And Mitch McConnell has already stated, he's pretty much told them, look, I understand you got to do what you got to do. And so I think Mitt Romney sort of being the outspoken individual, I would argue, does give cover to, again, maybe 2 or 3 additional Republicans who may look at their state races and say, you know what, I will lose this thing if I don't vote to impeach this guy, or to convict this guy, rather. And I believe you will see from the majority leader complete cover, because his number one obligation is to maintain his majority in the U.S. Senate. And if that means I have to allow or permit 2 or 3 additional senators to vote to get rid of this guy, even though I know it won't happen, hey, go for it.
All right. I want to talk about the Democrats here for a couple of minutes. We're going to take some of your questions in a few minutes if you have questions for the panel. So forewarned, we'll come around with a microphone so you can be heard. Is this a 4-person race right now? Do you see it that way? Warren, Biden, Sanders, Buttigieg, Adrienne?
Yeah, I do. I mean, you guys will probably remember this from 2007, 2008, and not really 2016, because it was really just Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders, or at this point in 2015, going to 2016. But the dinner that's formerly known as the Jefferson-Jackson dinner in Iowa, which just took place this past weekend, called the Liberty, what is it called now? The Liberty something dinner.
Probably freedom. Liberty.
Right, yeah, it's something like that. I know the acronym is LJ dinner. I can't keep track of all these names, but it is sort of known as the turning point for the race in Iowa for the Democrats, not necessarily for the Republicans, but for the Democrats. This, you all may recall, in 2007 was when Barack Obama really got himself. He was on the map, but really made a strong showing at this dinner, had a ton of grassroots supporters. People were blown away by him. And that's when he started to see his numbers move against Hillary Clinton in 2007. This was a big weekend for Mayor Pete in Iowa because he had, I think, 1,200, 1,300 people show up at this dinner. I heard from some of my friends who were there on other campaigns that Joe Biden's section was empty, or part of it was empty, and he wasn't able to get his grassroots people to turn out like Mayor Pete did. So I say all that to say, November is when things start to shift. You know, people go home for Thanksgiving dinner, they spend time with their family and their friends, they really start to talk about who they're going to support, who they're going to vote for. And there are a lot of people who do believe that Mayor Pete reminds them a lot of Barack Obama. He's getting, grassroots donations in small increments. He's got a lot of energy, a lot of enthusiasm. And his demographic, his viewpoints and his demographic, in large part reflect that of the Iowa caucus goers. So I say all that to say that I think it's going to be very difficult for somebody who's not in the top 4 or the top 5 right now to really break into that pack. Now, Amy Klobuchar could surprise us. She's from a neighboring state. But organization is key in Iowa. And Mayor Pete's campaign, Elizabeth Warren's campaign, maybe Joe Biden's not really known for having a strong organization in Iowa, but, he might get lucky just based on the fact that still Democrats time and time again say they believe that he is the strongest to run against Trump and has the best chance of being elected against Trump. That may pull him in a little bit, but I think we are starting to see even potentially a race between Warren, Mayor Pete, and possibly Bernie Sanders in Iowa. I'm not even sure that Joe Biden is going to crack. I think he'll crack the top 3, but I'm not sure that he'll even crack the top 2.
All right.
And then we'll see what happens after that.
Anthony, I want to ask you this question. You've been out in several states, not only covering the candidates, but talking with voters. Do you sense a growing unease about whether Democratic voters think they have a winner in the field, that one of the Democrats running can actually defeat Donald Trump?
I mean, I think you always hear that. I don't know if I sense, a widespread concern, but I was struck by the fact that speaking of Mayor Pete, I was in New Hampshire a couple of weeks ago, or maybe it was last week. Anyway, there was a Pete Buttigieg event in Concord, and it was really well attended, and there was a lot of excitement. And I talked to a line of voters who were all sort of sitting right next to each other, and interestingly, they all said great things about Elizabeth Warren. I adore Elizabeth Warren. They all said the same things about why they were supporting Mayor Pete. but we don't think she's electable, and Mayor Pete represents that sort of more moderate view, and he's brilliant, and he's young, and he's a veteran, and he's all these other great things. So I was struck by that. But no, at this point, I don't detect a sort of unease out there. But keep in mind, the voters that I'm coming into contact with and have been coming into contact with since, going on 3 or 4 months now, these are the early folks who, buy into these races super, super early.
Right.
So what you said about this being November and it really shifting, I think we're entering a time when this race begins to sort of nationalize and open up a little bit and go out to the folks who aren't spending their Tuesday mornings at a campaign event in Nashua.
Yeah.
Who does that?
And because of that, I would also be, I think this is the time to be particularly wary of polls. I think there's so much that we don't know because there are a lot of voters who will say things, to your point, Anthony, early in Elizabeth Warren's campaign, there was this whole idea that she was unlikable, and I never heard Democrats say that they didn't like her. Sometimes they would say, I like her a lot, I want her to stay in the Senate, or I like her a lot, but. And I think there is a concern, and it's something that I'm not sure polling questions pick up, but there is a sense of there are people who say, I like Elizabeth Warren, but I worry that she is not, other people won't vote for her, that people won't vote for a woman. Or I like Pete Buttigieg, but I worry that other people won't vote for a gay candidate. Or I like this one, and I worry but. And so I think a lot of the polling is picking up, I worry but when they go into the polls themselves, the result might be different. So I think there's still so many people, so many unpollable factors that it's just way too early. I think we're going to have to wait to see some of these primary races play out before we really know what's going to happen.
You brought this up earlier. Let me dig into it a little bit with this question. You've reported on this. Can Elizabeth Warren win the support that she needs across the spectrum of Democrats to push her over?
Possibly, but we don't know yet. I think it's still early. Looking at some of the crosstabs from some of the earlier polling, I think that there is evidence that she can. If you break down a lot of the support that the candidates are getting, Bernie Sanders is killing it with the young voters. He has this, that's where all of his support is, very, very limited support among folks over 50. The exact opposite with Joe Biden. He has all his supporters are in older voters. Now, older voters are reliable voters, but very, very few young people. And it breaks down with other candidates. Elizabeth Warren, across the board, it's like 25%, 26%, 25%, 20%, across all of those spectrum. And I think that's why that reflects also this idea that she's everybody's second choice. Well, folks are going to start falling or dropping out. And if she's the second choice, that's a good place to be. So I think it could go either way, but I think she don't count her out by any means.
All right, one more question, and then that I'll ask, and then we'll take questions from the audience. Anthony, on this subject, a few weeks ago you went to South Carolina to gauge Warren's support among African American voters, especially in the South, a voting bloc that'll almost certainly prove crucial to any 2020 Democratic nominee. What did you find for Warren?
Yeah, so in South Carolina, it's interesting because African Americans represent, I think, 2/3 of Democratic voters. So obviously a super important voting bloc. It's the voting bloc that propelled Barack Obama into Super Tuesday and helped Hillary Clinton. And Elizabeth Warren has some work to do. There's no question about it. Joe Biden is very, very popular down there. But again, it has to do with name recognition more than anything. His association with Barack Obama means everything to lots of African American voters down there, particularly older African Americans. So on the other hand, the trend is going in the right direction for Elizabeth Warren. She's still well behind Biden in South Carolina, but I think I looked at a poll from last summer, and she was 30 points down, and now the numbers are sort of 11 points down. So it's still a sizable margin, but she's trending in the right direction. But that's a really important question to ask, Bob, because right after South Carolina comes Super Tuesday, and you're talking about Alabama, Arkansas, Georgia, Tennessee, Texas, big African American voting blocks within the Democratic Party. So these Democrats need to make progress with those voters.
All right. Questions from the audience? All right, we have a question here. As the microphone's going to that gentleman right there, Anthony, I would like to point out that when you said rhetorically, who goes to these events on
I said it with admiration.
on nights and weekends?
Yeah.
What kind of crazy person does that? That would be you.
Yeah. That's the sad truth.
Sir.
When we get the president's tax returns, and I think we will get the president's tax returns, and we find out that perhaps there has been emolument problems and that he's been rather creative in his accounting, and possibly that some of the funds that kept him alive all these years came from creative sources. I know this is kind of speculation, but any thoughts on how that might affect the whole thing?
We already know the president has emolument problems. You know, I don't believe, and this, I'm speaking for myself, this is my opinion, I don't think that there is anything at this point, given everything else that we have found out, from his own remarks on the Access Hollywood tape to the fact that he is using his own resorts as a windfall, to the fact that he just tweeted out this week that everybody should buy his son's book after, you know, hitting Joe Biden over the head about Hunter Biden, after every Ukraine, the details that we did find out from the Mueller report. I'm not sure that there's anything in the tax returns that's going to be the thing that slays him, in part because one reason that his support has remained so solid is that he has a lot of voters who are the I don't like, but. I don't like his tweets, but I like the judges he's appointing to the court. I don't like the things he does, but I like what he's doing on immigration. He's tough and I want a wall. I don't like X, Y, or Z thing that he's doing, but he's clicking the box. That was the reason why I voted for him in the first place. And I think so long as that's the case, I'm not sure any new revelation is going to make which is one reason I think why Democrats are moving very quickly right now.
Yep.
It's because they waited for 2 years with the Mueller investigation and thinking that all these things would come up, and it didn't move the needle at all. And I think now they have something that's clear, easy to understand, probably easier than anything that comes out of the tax returns.
Anybody else want to weigh in on that?
And I just think we've reached a point where most people, Trump does something that's horrible, illegal, unethical, immoral, people just say, well, that's Trump. I mean, there's so much of his behavior and character that I think has become normalized that it really does benefit him. And this is likely going to go to the Supreme Court, sort of a conservative-leaning Supreme Court. There is nothing constitutionally that mandates the president has to reveal his tax returns. Now, Kimberly, you're an attorney, but I think that's going to be a serious question that will be posed by supporters of the president. That what mandates the president to do this? What's the reason from Democrats saying this should be revealed? And if it does, I would watch the folks in the middle, those independent voters. How many of those folks move? And thus far, we've seen maybe 1 or 2% increases, and that seems to fluctuate depending on what poll you look at. So I'm not certain it will have a significant impact on 2020.
All right, another question?
Given the likely timing of the impeachment proceedings, how badly could Senators Warren and Sanders be hurt if they're sitting in Washington for most of January rather than on the campaign trail? And is Mayor Pete the major beneficiary of that? And if they miss out on Iowa, how will that affect those two in particular going forward?
Adrienne.
Yeah, you know, I mean, I've talked about this a lot on MSNBC, usually posed by one of the anchors saying, you know, oh, God, this has got to be a disaster for anybody who's a sitting United States senator for having to, you know, be back in Washington in January during impeachment hearings and not on the campaign trail. I don't think it's going to be as bad because, first of all, voters, especially in Iowa, are going to have a pretty decent idea where they stand in January, right? Campaigns are going to have paid advertising. They're going to have, you know, they're going to barnstorm the state with field operatives. I don't think it's certainly not ideal, but I don't think all of a sudden Joe Biden, Pete Buttigieg, some of these down ballot candidates who are not sitting United States senators are all of a sudden going to have like a chance to really, massively move up. Because in January, what matters the most is that you're raising money to fuel your campaign operation. Iowa is all won by organization. Polls matter, of course, but you got to get your people to come out to the caucuses. They've got to sit around there for 3 hours on a Tuesday night and hang out and caucus. So you've got to figure out how to organize your people, how to organize your supporters, how to make sure that you've got second ballot supporters, people who, if a candidate doesn't reach 15%, you can get those people in your corner. It's all about organization. So I don't think that it's going to have this detrimental effect on any sitting United States senator like the perception among many of my friends in the media tend to believe.
Kimberly?
I would agree with that assessment. I think it will hurt all of the candidates because, again, this will be where this is going to be a campaign that is won or lost nationally. I don't mean popularly, obviously.
Yeah.
But it's national in a way that I think it reduces the importance of these individual early states. They're not going to be the harbingers that they normally are. These candidates have to be using everything that they can to be making their pitch to everybody at the same time. And the longer that the impeachment is the headline heading into 2020, I think that hurts everybody. But yeah, I don't think it hurts first of all, every single senator in this race, we know how they're going to vote. I have seen, they're already sitting senators and running for president. There'll be times that I will see Elizabeth Warren on Capitol Hill at, 10 a.m. and then by 2 p.m. she's in New Hampshire. This is already happening. I think that they can, as long as planes are flying, they can make their way back and forth.
Yep.
All right, another question? Right back there, all the way back.
It's always been a dream of mine to be on NPR, so I'm going to consider this as counting. So I had a question about media coverage of these candidates, and we see that Bernie Sanders leading far and above in fundraising amongst the Democratic challengers. We see him at or near some of the top of the polls in a lot of the swing states or a lot of the early polling states. But yet, when you read stuff like 538, that weekly reports on the media coverage, he lags very far behind in third, sometimes even fourth, depending on the flavor of the week. And that is both across positive and negative media coverage, which Trump taught us is just as good, sometimes better than positive media coverage. So I guess my question for you is why you think that is when he does seem to be garnering a lot of the conventional support that would lead to more airtime, why he receives such little commentary or such little press across the major media sources.
Can I answer this quickly?
Yeah. Sure.
Take it first. Very short answer is I think people know, and you see this in the numbers, you see this in the polls, he's got a ceiling, he's got a cap. He cannot, it ebbs anywhere from 19 to 22% of the vote. Sometimes it dips down to 12 or 13, depending on where you are. But I think when you look into some of these numbers, the reason why the media doesn't take him perhaps as seriously as they should is because they believe that there is a ceiling for Bernie Sanders, that if it came down to 2 candidates in the race or even 3 candidates in the race, that he would still not increase his lead among where he currently is. That's my thought.
Anthony, do you want to touch on
Well,
that?
I can talk about sort of the way we treat the Bernie Sanders story, and sort of I can opine about the sort of. I accept the premise of your story that of your question that Bernie Sanders isn't taken entirely seriously by the national press. And I think one of the things that's going on there, I heard David Axelrod say something really smart the other day on a podcast. He was a former advisor to President Obama. And he said what the media tends to obsess about, and actually political operatives, you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, is movement. So if Elizabeth Warren is moving up, she is a contender and people are paying a lot of attention to her. If Joe Biden is moving down, that's a story. But when a candidate is sort of static, it's not really a good sign or a sign that things are evolving or changing, so it becomes less of a story. That said, I know in the WBUR newsroom, we're aware of it. I was just covering Bernie Sanders, a rally in New Hampshire last week, and I made the point that he's as well organized in New Hampshire as any other candidate. He's raising more money, which you said, than any other candidate. And according to what poll you look at, he's in front of he's at least in the top 2 or 3. So we take him seriously. But I appreciate the premise of your question.
He had a heart attack and it didn't hurt his numbers at all. I think that's pretty incredible, and it speaks to his level of support.
And I just want to add one thing. As somebody who worked on Hillary Clinton's campaign in 2016, no one should ever underestimate Bernie Sanders. Yeah. He almost won Iowa. He blew us out of the water in New Hampshire. We thought Martin O'Malley was going to be our big, we got a big opposition research book on Martin O'Malley. Martin O'Malley didn't get more than 1%. In fact, in some polls, he literally got 500 people surveyed, not one person said they were with Martin O'Malley. Nobody should ever underestimate Bernie Sanders, and that includes the media.
Great.
All right. Any other questions out there? Oh, right. Okay.
Hello. I feel like I read a lot in different news articles about this party is going to have a reckoning if they don't if they don't win the election. The Republican Party is going to have a reckoning. The Democratic Party. Can both of you, Adrienne and Shermichael, talk a bit about what you think losing the election would mean for your party?
I mean, in an ideal world, I kind of would like for my party to lose.
I still have no idea why he's not a Democrat.
I'm being honest. I don't think, as a conservative, and now I'll get into some philosophy here. There's nothing about Donald Trump's temperament that is conservative. And when I think about conservatism, I think about, customs of behavior. I think about values. I think about the importance of faith. I think about all of those things. And the question for me has always been, under his presidency, what exactly are we conserving? I have an appreciation for liberalism. I have a lot of friends who are Democrats, and I recognize that you need the two, right? I think conservatism plays an important role in saying, wait a minute, to our liberal friends, let's be a little cautious with some of this change. Let's make sure there aren't unintended consequences here. But I also think the liberals say, wait a minute, conservative, let's not be too conservative. Some progress is necessary for human development. And so I think you sort of have to have the two. So the question for me has always been, under the era of Trump, we're sort of becoming reactionary. And I don't think, you could study every conservative philosopher from Robert Nozick to Michael Oakeshott to Sir Roger Scruton to Edmund Burke, who's sort of considered the Western founding father of modern day conservatism. And there's always been this premise that we reform in order to conserve. The understanding being that if we are trying to conserve certain institutions or value of culture and life, we must recognize that modernity is an innate part of the human experience. And so to be reactionary is sort of counterintuitive, intellectually speaking, to those things. So that's why I would, not like for the guy to win, because my hope would be the Republican Party would sort of reach a point where it realizes we have to reset. The demographics of the country are changing. I don't think 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now that the Republican Party, if we continue on the current trajectory that we're on, will be able to compete nationally. I just don't think it's possible. The numbers just aren't there. I think Democrats have a much higher ceiling as far as their ability to sort of grab new voters and pull them in and under their tent. The Republican Party, not so much. And I think that there are various individuals from the African-American community, the Hispanic community, the Asian community, who do maintain and hold conservative values that can be actualized into policies that said communities will support. I don't think that's currently happening under this current administration. So hopefully if there were to be a loss or a lose, then maybe we can reset and sort of, get back on the proper course. So those are my thoughts to your question.
Adrienne.
I look at it less about how it's going to affect the Democratic Party going forward, but more about how it's going to affect the country. Donald Trump barely got elected in 2016. If he gets reelected in 2020, he is going to see his reelection as a mandate. All the policies that we've seen him try to ram through, or at least, the situation of the border, through executive orders, he will take that. He will see this as a clear-cut sign that everything that he's done so far, he should amp it up times 20 or times 1,000. Because he has been reelected. But I also I obviously want 1,000% for Democrats to win in 2020, but you also got to look at redistricting and how that's going to affect the map in 2024. And to the point that Shermichael just said, the Democratic Party electorate in general, the fact that we are younger, we are more diverse. The Republicans, with all due respect, Shermichael, tend to be a dying breed. They're kind of like the old white folks who are to an extent a dying breed. 2024, the map in the 2024 presidential election for Democrats is going to be, we're going to have such a major advantage because we're going to gain seats in North Carolina. We're going to gain seats in Texas. We're going to lose seats in states like Ohio, maybe even Iowa, states that have not trended in the favor of Democrats, especially in the last election. We're going to be gaining seats in key states, key battleground states that we need in order to win the presidency in 2024. So, I mean, I don't even want to talk about what my age is going to be in 2024. I'd like to see a Democratic president elected in 2020, but I also hold high hopes that and firmly believe that 2024 is going to be a very good year, regardless of whether or not Trump gets reelected, whether a Democrat is sitting in the White House in 2021. 2024 is going to be a very good year for Democrats.
All right, I think we have time for a couple more questions. This gentleman right here, I saw him.
I'd appreciate your comments on whether or not the Democrats could make any headway with Trump's base by being friendlier to business.
Who wants to try this on? Did you get the question?
I mean, I did.
Can Democrats make headway with Trump base if they appeal to business?
I mean, I don't think so. I think the ardent supporters are there. I think that one could make a cogent argument to what I like to refer to as movable voters. And these are the voters who voted either once or twice for President Obama, but for whatever reason in 2016 decided to vote for Donald Trump. I don't think those people are as locked into Trumpism as the narrative sort of dictates. And I think with the right candidate and the right VP and the right messaging, I think you can engage those voters in a way to pull them back into the Democratic corner. And I don't think you need a lot of them. I mean, Trump won Pennsylvania, 44,000 votes. Michigan, 10,000 votes. Wisconsin, 22,000 votes. We're not talking about a substantial number here. So just imagine if you're able to maximize your base and also pull enough of those movable voters into your corner, then theoretically speaking, you could see a Democrat win in 2020, but there are so many different variables that could, change that.
Yeah, I'm going to disagree with that. I think a little bit. I think that the swingable Trump voter is a bit of a unicorn, and I think that if the Democrats are going to lose in 2020, one reason will be because that's who they are chasing. I mean, you're absolutely right. In Michigan, for example, Trump won by 10,000 votes. 40,000 people in Michigan voted for Jill Stein. Democrats it's a numbers game. It is a turnout game. They have to pitch why people should register, get out, and vote as opposed to stay home. They have to appeal to Democratic-leaning independents and get them into polling stations if they are going to win. I think the more energy spent on trying to flip a Trump voter is energy taken away from where it really ought to be.
Well, I wouldn't say ardent Trump voters. I would say, to your point, I agree 100%. You look at the data across tabulations, there were substantial independent-leaning independents who did vote for Trump. And quite a few networks have actually sort of polled those folks now, and they say, I will not vote for this guy in 2020. So let me add some clarity. Those are the people that I'm talking about. Again, not those strong, diehard Trump voters.
Adrienne.
Yeah, I just want to add one point to that. I'm sure some of you heard Hillary Clinton essentially calling, without saying Tulsi Gabbard's name, but calling somebody, a candidate running in this Democratic primary, a Russian asset. One of the reasons why she made that point is because even if Tulsi's not realizing this, the Russian propaganda machine is propping her up. They want her to run as a third-party challenger because they know the only way, or one of the only ways, that Trump is going to get reelected in part is because you're going to have somebody, Jill Stein times 5, who's going to draw away some support from the Democrats. And Jill Stein, sure, we're always going to have a third-party candidate, right? She got about 1.5% of the overall popular vote in 2016. But I think we should assume this time that there's going to be a third-party challenger. I'm not talking about a Ross Perot type or even a Howard Schultz type. We're going to have somebody that the Russian propaganda machine, the Chinese propaganda machine, whomever else is out there, there's going to be somebody that is being propped up, that is being used to try to divide the Democrats, and that is not going to even possibly be coming from the Trump campaign. It's going to come from an outside source. It's going to come from an adversarial government. And I sort of deviated from the topic, but I think we've always got to bear that in mind. This is not, Trump could get reelected with 40% of the vote, or 40% of the popular vote. Bill Clinton won in 1992 with 41% of the popular vote. Keep that in mind. We could see something very similar this time around, especially with Trump's very ardent base, but his inability so far to really increase and expand his base from the 2016 campaign.
All right, one last question from the audience. Saw a hand go up in the middle over there, right smack in the middle. Yep.
Hi, so I'm a person who's been a tried and true Democrat my whole life. And I just want to ask, we talk about the possibility of the Democrats winning in 2024. I'm an old man. I can't wait that long. And I just want to ask a question about, so in 2016, the Democrats lost an election to perhaps the most unelectable person in the universe, in Donald Trump. And everything I see up till now, all the polls up until then were telling me in 2016 that Donald Trump was losing until he won. And I want to know what's different, what needs to be different with the Democratic Party this time. I don't want to hear about 2024. I want to hear how we're going to win 2020.
Well, I want to hear what our two excellent consultants have to say about that, but I'll just say super quickly, I mean, this is at the heart of the debate in the Democratic campaign for president right now. Do you go hard left and really excite the base and get, as Kimberly suggested, as many people out to the poll because they're excited to vote? That's the Elizabeth Warren approach and the Bernie Sanders approach as well. Or do you pay attention to those warnings in the polling the New York Times published and go toward the middle, moderate, Joe Biden, Pete Buttigieg? And I really think that's the debate that's going to be fascinating to watch in the coming weeks and months. But that's as well as I can answer your question.
Yeah, and I just, look, I appreciate the premise of your question, and I think you're exactly right. I think one of the problems that we had in 2016 was we did have a lack of enthusiasm, which is why I'm glad that Kimberly brought up the fact that you've got to have people who are energized and excited, which is why when I see and hear people say, oh, Elizabeth Warren can't win against Trump, I discount that because she has so much more energy and enthusiasm. She got, 26,000 people in Prospect Park in New York. I mean, she's drawing enormous crowds. Hillary's extraordinary, but we could not get the kind of crowds that Mayor Pete, that Bernie Sanders, that Elizabeth Warren are getting on the campaign trail. And I think you can't discount how important that is and how much you have to factor that into the 2020 election. If Joe Biden becomes the nominee and somehow gets out of this very progressive leftward-leaning primary, he's going to have to pick somebody. He's going to have to pick a running mate that can really energize the base. Again, I still believe at the end of the day, what happened in 2018 is going to be what happens in 2020. Maybe we're not going to see the same strong numbers that we saw for Democrats in the midterms, but voters are still going to vote on the issues. They're going to vote on health care. They're going to vote on the economy. Sure, the economy is doing fine right now, but a lot of people aren't feeling it. Trump has done nothing on health care. His base, yeah, sure, they may stick with him even though he hasn't repealed health care, but independents, moderate swing voters are still very upset that fixes to Obamacare have not been made or that Medicare for all is not enacted. Whatever their issue is, they are looking at this president saying he has not done what he promised he would do, and it's affecting my life. And I still firmly believe that those are the issues that are going to drive people to the polls, even though it's going to be very, very slim, but in the favor of Democrats in 2020.
I would just add, the Pew Research Center, I want to say 3 or 4 months ago, had a very interesting study. And what it revealed was that most voters on the left and the right already know who they're going to vote for. Now, maybe on the left it's a little different, but they know that they're engaged and they know that they plan to vote in November of next year. So the question ultimately becomes the folks in the middle. What are they going to do? And I think if I was a Democrat, and I talked to a lot of my friends who are Democrats who are working on some of the campaigns, some are working at the DCCC, which is the congressional arm to help Democrats get elected in the House. And I share with them my thoughts as a Republican looking at what's going on, within their party. And one of my gravest concerns is that they nominate someone who, let's say someone who excites the base, but someone who struggles with key demo groups within the party. I mean, African Americans. I mean, Hispanics. Donald Trump did incredibly well with Hispanic men, despite all of his crazy assertions about Hispanics. Donald Trump did better than Mitt Romney and John McCain with African American men. In fact, I actually believe he'll be able to slightly increase his percent with African American men. So when you think about those numbers and you think about what it takes to beat him in those key swing states, when I cited those numbers, exciting the base won't be enough. You're going to need some of those folks, I would argue, in the middle who may actually vote for Trump, We think, all African Americans, they're going to vote for Democrat. All Hispanics, they're going to vote for. That's not the case. And so I think Democrats just have to be very, very careful with whomever they choose as the nominee. They have to have someone to balance that ticket out. If it's Elizabeth Warren, who's going to be the moderate? If it's a Joe Biden, who's going to be the progressive? I think if they can figure that out, then I think the odds are pretty good for them.
All right, I got a couple of questions. I want really fast answers on this because we want to close this out. You can either use an analytical approach to answer these, or you can use the WAG, which is the wild ass guess. What issue do you think the Democratic race is going to swing on?
The primary.
Kimberly?
The primary?
Yeah.
I think healthcare. I think that's the #1 topic.
I agree.
I agree.
Healthcare, yeah.
All right. Is the November election all about Donald Trump, or will there be other issues that rise to the top?
Issues.
The Democrats better hope that it's not only about Donald Trump, because it should be about the issues.
But that being said, I think the #1 issue among the Democrats that I talk to is beating Donald Trump. So I think it's both.
Shermichael?
Beating Trump to energize the base, issues for everyone else.
And is there a scenario under which anyone here sees Donald Trump resigning?
No.
No.
He may actually
Absolutely
not want to leave. Forget resigning.
He was at a rally today. He was talking about being in office for another 21 years. He literally said that.
Yeah. Anthony heard me say this a couple of weeks ago. I said, and Mick Mulvaney, when he spoke on a Sunday show a couple of weeks ago, made me think about this a little bit more. When he called Trump a person who considers himself to be in the hospitality business, never mind the fact that he has a title now. Even if, in the unlikely event the Republican Senate turns on him, there is no Barry Goldwater moment for Donald Trump because there are no Republican senators who could go to him like they went to Richard Nixon and convince Trump to resign. I think he'd say, frankly, go screw yourself. I'll work the rest of my life to take you down. I think the only way that he actually considers resigning is if his kids go to him and say that, dear Dad, regardless of what happens in Washington, the Trump brand lives on. And if you do not step down, you will irreparably damage the Trump brand in the U.S. and around the world. And I think that as a creature of the Trump organization, he might then consider.
They'd have to add, and you're costing us $1 billion a day.
Yeah. Okay. I don't think that's going to happen. All right. So, shameless self-promotion. Anthony and Kimberly, tell us about a story or stories you're working on that you can give us a little taste of for the coming weeks.
Yeah, I mean, I'm obviously keeping a close watch on the impeachment proceedings as they move forward. Obviously, a lot of folks that many of you voted for are key players in this race. You have Catherine Clark in leadership. You have Congressman Lynch and Congresswoman Presley and others who are sitting on these key committees. So I will be watching that moving forward.
All right, Anthony?
Back to New Hampshire next week. I think Iowa the following week. I'm also working on a feature about the Wall Street investor community's growing concern about the prospect of an Elizabeth Warren presidency.
All right. And the week before last, I was up in Canada with WBUR producer Wilder Fleming, with Bernie talking up the Canadian healthcare system, and with Elizabeth Warren sort of signing on to that. We went to Canada to do some reporting on the pluses and the minuses of the Canadian healthcare system. The Canadians generally love their system, but I'll tell you, we saw closed emergency rooms and many people who cannot get access to healthcare because they do not have a primary care doctor. Wow. Huge parts of the population. So we'll be reporting on that in the coming weeks as well. Want to thank all our guests for coming in tonight. Kimberly, it was so cool to see you on TV last night with Chris Matthews, and then having you here tonight. Thanks for coming up. Anthony Brooks, always great to see you.
Thank you.
Shermichael Singleton, very nice to meet you. Great conversation. Wow. And the same to Adrienne Elrod. Thanks a lot. Thanks for coming up. You can continue this conversation on our website at politics@wbur.org. And in case you didn't know, we have a weekly politics newsletter on what's being talked about in the Capitol and on the campaign trail as it relates to you. It's written by Kimberly Atkins and covers our politicians and the presidential campaign and policy changes. Very interesting, really very much worthwhile read. If you're not signed up, if you are signed up. If you're not, go to wbur.org/politics newsletter, or one of our staff can help you in the lobby so you don't miss out on the next issue. Thank you all very much for coming out tonight. Stay in the loop with our political coverage online and on air, and with our City Space series, which was talked about earlier. Get Educated, the defining issues of the 2020 election, beginning in January 2020. Hosts and journalists doing an 8-part series in 2020 on a whole host of issues. Watch our website for the schedule, and please come back to join us then. Have a great night, everyone.